The hum was a constant, low thrum against the soles of my worn work boots, vibrating up through the linoleum. It was the sound of the school hallway after midnight, the lockers humming, a mechanical chorus of dormant electricity and trapped air. Fluorescent tubes flickered overhead, casting long, stark shadows that stretched and shrank with each subtle pulse, like a slow, breathing organism. I knew this hum. It was the soundtrack to my solitude, the only consistent companion in these desolate hours. My mop bucket, a dented plastic contraption, clattered softly as I pushed it along. The squeak of its wheels was an affront in the oppressive quiet, each revolution echoing down the empty corridor. I preferred it this way after everyone had gone. No students, no teachers, just me and the endless stretch of waxed floor. It gave me space to think, or more accurately to not think, to let the monotonous rhythm of my work lull the sharper edges of my grief. It had been months now since the last of it. The aimlessness was the worst part. A vast, empty ocean where my compass had shattered and I was just drifting. This job, pushing a mop through the deserted arteries of a school, was less a career and more a holding pattern, a way to exist without having to truly live. The air was cool, carrying the faint, sterile scent of disinfectant mixed with something else, something stale and trapped like old ambition. I paused by a bank of lockers, running a hand over the cold metal. Each one a sealed box holding secrets, forgotten lunches, crumpled notes, like me I thought, sealed off. What good was a fresh start when the past clung to I like a shroud? I needed something, anything. A sign, a push, a reason to care again. Then the call came. Not a call exactly. A message left on the school's administrative line, picked up by a colleague who still lingered in the main office finishing paperwork. He found me eventually, his footsteps surprisingly loud against the linoleum. He held a crumpled sticky note. Odd one for I. I took the note. The handwriting was neat, precise. A name, Eleanor Vance. A firm, Vance & Sons, solicitors, and a number, no explanation. My brow furrowed. I didn't know any solicitors. I didn't know anyone named Eleanor Vance. My family. What was left of it had dwindled to nothing, a forgotten branch on a dead tree. They said it was urgent, something about an estate. The colleague added, his gaze curious, a flicker of interest in his usually placid eyes. He went back to his office, leaving me alone again, the humming lockers my only witness. An estate. The word felt alien on my tongue. My parents had left me little more than a box of old photographs and a mountain of quiet sorrow. I had no other relatives, none that I knew of anyway. I stared at the note, the neat script a stark contrast to the chaos inside me. My fingers traced the numbers. Urgent. Estate. What could possibly be urgent about my non-existent past? I called them the next morning, my voice feeling rusty from disuse. The woman on the other end, the solicitor, had a crisp, formal tone. Her words were carefully chosen, precise, like stones laid out on a path. She spoke of an ancestral home, a property I had inherited. A remote, decaying place far from here, tucked away in a corner of the world I'd never heard of. My great-aunt, a woman I hadn't known existed, had passed, leaving everything to me. Seth, the last of the line. The news hit me with a strange mix of disbelief and a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of something else. Hope. The solicitor made it sound like a burden, an obligation. The house was old. She explained, very old and largely neglected. It would require considerable attention, or she suggested I could simply sell it. Liquidate the assets, take the money and run. But the word ancestral lingered, a house, a home, something rooted, something that had endured for generations. I had nothing rooted. I'll take it, I heard myself say, the words surprising even me. A sudden surge of determination, foreign and yet familiar, bloomed in my chest. A push, a reason. Very well, Mr. Vance. I'll send I the details, the keys, directions. She rattled off the address, a string of forgotten names and numbers that meant nothing to me. It was in the countryside, she said, very isolated, no close neighbors, just the house and whatever lay within its walls. I hung up, the receiver feeling heavy in my hand. The weight of it, the weight of this unexpected inheritance, settled over me. A remote, decaying ancestral home, a place I never knew existed, now suddenly mine. Was it a chance to finally bury the ghosts of my past, or simply to acquire new ones? Was this the fresh start I craved, or merely a heavier chain binding me to something even older, something I couldn't yet comprehend? I needed to leave. I needed to see this place. But what awaited me there in that distant, forgotten house? The weight of it, the weight of the unknown, settled into my bones like a cold seep. A house, an inheritance from a relative I'd never heard of, tucked away in some forgotten corner of the countryside. A fresh start, I told myself. A chance to shed the suffocating grief, the aimlessness that had become my shadow. I was determined, not just to move, but to change, to build something new out of the dust of the old. The drive was endless. The paved roads thinned, then cracked, then gave way to gravel and eventually a pair of muddy tracks winding through overgrown fields. The sky, a bruised purple-gray, hung low and heavy. My hands, tight on the steering wheel, were slick with a nervous sweat that had nothing to do with the car's failing heater. Then, through a curtain of unkempt evergreens, I saw it. It wasn't just a house. It was a silhouette against the fading light, a jagged tooth in the mouth of the wilderness. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from under heavy brows of sagging eaves. A sprawling, asymmetrical monstrosity that seemed to sag in on itself, as if the very air around it were too heavy to bear. It exuded a profound, ancient weariness. My determination wavered, a tiny tremor in my resolve. This wasn't a fresh start, it felt like an ending. The wrought iron gate, rusted and half off its hinges, groaned a protest as I pushed it open. The driveway, once grand, was now a crumbling path swallowed by weeds. No birdsong, no distant hum of traffic. Just the wind, a low, mournful sigh through the branches. I stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The house loomed, a silent observer. I felt a prickle on my skin, the distinct sensation of being watched. No doorbell, no answer, of course not. The estate agent had sent a key. The lock mechanism groaned, a dry, protesting rasp before finally clicking open. I pushed the door inward. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the dust of decades, heavy and still. It smelled of forgotten things, of mildew and something unidentifiable, a faint metallic tang. I stepped over the threshold into the maw. My breath hitched. I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight beam cutting a weak swat through the gloom. The hall was cavernous, stretching into an unseen distance. Dust motes danced in the weak beam of my light, swirling like miniature galaxies. Tapestries, faded to indistinct blurs, hung from the walls, their threads crumbling. I walked deeper, my steps tentative. Each room I peered into was a tomb of forgotten furniture draped in white sheets, ghostly shapes in the twilight. A vast drawing room with a fireplace large enough to stand in. A dining room with a table that could seat 20, now obscured by a shroud. The house was enormous, a labyrinth of decaying grandeur. My own voice felt too loud in the stillness, so I kept silent, listening to the house breathe. Or was it just me? A low hum, almost imperceptible, seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. I stopped, tilting my head. There was it the wind, a distant electrical line. It was so faint, almost a phantom sound. Then for a split second, the hum intensified, morphing into a familiar rhythmic thrumming. My mind snagged. For an instant, I wasn't in the decaying hall. I was standing in a brightly lit school hallway after midnight, lockers humming, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and stale chalk. The fluorescent lights buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow on the rows of metal doors. My own reflection, distorted in a locker door, stared back with wide, terrified eyes. The hum was everywhere, vibrating through the cold metal, a sound that promised something terrible was about to happen, something I couldn't escape. Then just as quickly, the image shattered. I was back in the house, my heart racing. My breath rasped in my throat. It was just my mind playing tricks. It was getting to me. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I continued my exploration, trying to push the unsettling image from my mind. In what might have been a library, the shelves were filled with leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and faded. The air here was even heavier, saturated with the scent of old paper and dust. I ran my hand over a polished wooden desk, feeling the grit of accumulated time. My fingers brushed against something hard, a small, intricate carving. A face, distorted, grotesque, its mouth open in a silent scream. My hand recoiled. The light from my phone flickered just for a second, then steadied. It was nothing, a loose connection, and in that tiny, fractional moment I thought I heard it. Not a distinct word, but a breathy, drawn-out sound like a sigh right beside my ear. I spun around, the beam of my phone sweeping across the empty room. Nothing. There was I truly alone in this vast, decaying house. The house was a gaping maw, breathing out a chill even on a mild autumn day. I had spent the last week trying to fill it to make it mine, but every piece of furniture I dragged in, every box I unpacked, felt swallowed by the vast, echoing spaces. My determination, once a steady flame, flickered in the constant draft. I told myself this was normal. An old house, a new beginning, a mind still raw from loss. It was all just adjustment. I was in what I hoped would become my study, a room lined with empty, dust-filmed shelves. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and something else, something vaguely metallic like rust or forgotten blood. I ran a cloth over a mahogany desk, stirring up a cloud of fine, gray powder. My fingers brushed against a small, intricate carving on the desktop, a swirling, knot-like pattern that seemed to writhe under my touch. It wasn't decorative. It felt like a brand. A faint scratching sound reached me then from somewhere above. The attic probably, squirrels, mice, the usual inhabitants of forgotten places. I made a mental note to check the roofline, but the sound wasn't quite a scamper. It was more deliberate, like claws dragging slowly, rhythmically across a wooden surface. Scrape, scrape, pause, scrape. I stopped wiping the desk. The silence that followed was heavier than the dust. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Just the faint groan of the house settling, the distant drip of a leaky faucet in the kitchen I hadn't yet fixed. My shoulders relaxed. An old house. It made noises. I'd set my worn paperback on a small side table before going to the kitchen. When I returned, the book wasn't where I'd left it. It was on the floor, spine cracked, a few feet away as if it had been casually tossed aside. I stared at it. My memory was usually sharp, meticulous even. I was certain I'd placed it squarely on the table. Had I knocked it off without realizing? Perhaps the table wasn't level. I bent down, picked up the book, smoothing its cover. I tested the table. Solid. Unmoving. A shiver traced its way down my spine, but I dismissed it. Grief, stress, a new environment, all could make a person clumsy, forgetful. The house was settling in around me and I around it, that was all. I placed the book back on the table, more carefully this time, aligning it perfectly with the edge. I watched it for a full minute, half expecting it to tumble again. It didn't. The scratching sound became more frequent, sometimes from the attic, sometimes from behind a wall I couldn't access, sometimes from right outside my bedroom door. I tried to sleep, but the house had other plans. The air in my bedroom grew heavy, thick with a scent I couldn't quite place, something acrid like old pennies mixed with the damp earth of a freshly dug grave. I tossed, I turned. The scratching started again right outside my door, a soft, insistent drag. My breath hitched. It wasn't mice. It wasn't squirrels. It was too regular, too deliberate. My eyes snapped open. I wasn't in my bed. I was standing in a school hallway after midnight, lockers humming. The yellowed linoleum stretched endlessly before me, reflecting the sickly glow. Each locker, a dull gray rectangle, pulsed with a low, mechanical thrum. It wasn't just a hum. It was a vibration I could feel in my teeth, a low-frequency drone that seemed to vibrate the very air. I tried to move to speak, but my limbs felt weighted, my throat seized. The hallway was utterly deserted, yet I felt intensely watched. It wasn't a comforting sound. It was a sound of immense, contained pressure, of something trying to break free. Not a single voice, but a multitude, a soft, sibilant chorus that snaked through the locker vents, slithered under the closed doors. They weren't words I could discern, just a rush of breath, a collective exhalation of sorrow and longing. A locker at the far end of the hall, one among hundreds, clicked. A tiny, almost imperceptible sound, yet it echoed in the unnatural quiet. Then a faint groan like old metal straining. It felt hungry. It had been a dream, a vivid, terrifying dream, the product of stress, of grief, of sleeping in a strange old house. I repeated the words like a mantra, trying to soothe the tremors in my hands. But the acrid metallic scent still clung to the air, sharper now, almost stinging my nostrils. And the scratching, soft and rhythmic, had resumed. It wasn't outside my door anymore. It was coming from inside my bedroom wall, right beside my head. I closed my eyes, willing it to stop. It didn't. It intensified, becoming a frantic scuttling, a desperate clawing. I flung myself out of bed, fumbling for the light switch. I stared at the wall, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't large, no bigger than my palm, but its outline was distinct. And within its murky depths, barely visible, I could just make out the swirling, knot-like pattern I had seen carved into the desk. What was seeping from the walls of this place? And why did it carry the mark of a pattern I was only just beginning to notice everywhere? Later that evening, the house made more noises. I tried to convince myself it was just an old structure settling, a symphony of decay and neglect. But the distant drip from the kitchen faucet, which I'd mentally noted to fix, had a new, insistent rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. It wasn't just water. It sounded like a slow, deliberate tapping. I found myself moving with a new caution, my ears strained, my breath held. The air in the study, usually still and cool, felt heavy, like a blanket of invisible dust had settled on my lungs. I'd catch myself scanning the empty corners, my gaze lingering on the shadows that stretched long and distorted from the dim desk lamp. There was that a flicker in my peripheral vision, just beyond the bookshelves. A deeper shade of black in the already profound gloom. I'd snap my head around, but there was never anything there. Just the familiar, oppressive silence. This was specific. It would pass as quickly as it came, leaving a prickling sensation on my arms, the fine hairs standing on end. It felt like plunging into ice water, an invisible, freezing current. I snatched my hand back, my heart racing, staring at the empty space as if it held a visible threat. Nothing. just the faint smell of old paper and dust. I told myself it was drafts, faulty wiring, my imagination. But the rationalizations felt thin, transparent. They didn't explain the subtle scrapes against the floorboards upstairs when I was alone downstairs, or the way the faint scent of something like damp earth and old iron would sometimes bloom in the air, then vanish. I wasn't just hearing things, I was feeling them. The house was no longer just a house. It was a presence. My determination, a stubborn ember I'd carried through recent grief, began to shift its focus. No longer content to merely dismiss these occurrences, I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening, to find a logical explanation before I completely lost my mind. I started with the internet, but then I dug deeper. I found old local news archives, digitized and barely legible. Mentions of the house were sparse, but a few caught my eye. A brief article from the 1930s about a tragic disappearance of a previous owner, a reclusive artist. Another, even older, from the late 1800s, spoke of strange illnesses plaguing the residents, leading to a family abandoning the property. No details, just vague, unsettling allusions. The house itself held more tangible clues. In a forgotten drawer of the massive oak desk, beneath a stack of brittle, yellowed ledgers, I found a small, leather-bound journal. It was old, the pages thin as onion skin, filled with elegant, looping script in faded brown ink. The first few entries were mundane, observations about the weather, gardening notes. But then the tone shifted. The handwriting became more frantic, the lines less even. It follows, a breath on the nape of the neck even when the fire roars. Asterisk the sounds, never clear, always just beyond comprehension, a constant hum. I see it in the corners of my eye, it watches. My breath hitched. The journal was describing my experiences almost verbatim. The author, a woman whose name I still hadn't found, was writing about the same presence I felt. She detailed her growing paranoia, her sleepless nights, her desperate attempts to find solace. It feeds. The journal ended abruptly after that. No further entries, no explanation. I closed the journal, my fingers trembling, the leather cover feeling suddenly repulsive. The air in the study grew heavy, pressing in on me. The single desk lamp seemed to dim, though I knew it hadn't. I could feel the invisible eyes on me more intensely than ever before. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. I needed to stand, to move, to break the spell. I pushed back from the desk, the chair scraping loudly on the floorboards. The sound echoed, too loud, too sharp. And then everything changed. The study dissolved. I was standing in a long, narrow space. Fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sickly yellow glow on rows of metal lockers. The air smelled of stale disinfectant and old gym shoes. Where was I? How had I gotten here? My mind screamed for answers, but my body was frozen, unable to move, unable to even blink. The humming grew louder, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the lockers themselves. It wasn't moving, not exactly, but it advanced, an absence of light consuming the already dim space. What was it? What did it want, her? Descent. The last word had been smudged, a frantic scribble across the page, as if the writer's hand had trembled violently. I traced the faint indentations with my finger, the cold paper a stark contrast to the sudden heat in my chest. The journal was more than a record. It was a mirror. Every chilling sensation, every creeping doubt, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, he had felt it too. I was not alone in this, not in my experience, but terribly alone in my understanding. I turned the page, my fingers sticky with a nervous sweat. The next entries were less personal, more historical, yet no less unsettling. They were fragments, really snatched pieces of information about the house's previous occupants, meticulously copied from what she referred to as the old town ledgers and parish records. Her handwriting, once elegant, grew spidery, the lines often trailing off or slanting wildly. She wrote of a merchant, a man named Thomas, who had purchased the house in the late 1800s. He'd arrived with his family, full of ambition, only to slowly withdraw from society. The entries detailed his growing reclusiveness, his disturbing pronouncements during Sunday sermons, eventually his complete disappearance. "No body found," she'd scrawled in the margin next to the date of his vanishing. Just an empty chair by the hearth, a lingering scent of decay. Then came a family, the Millers, in the early 1900s. The wife, a quiet woman, had reportedly begun speaking to empty rooms, her voice carrying through open windows at odd hours. Her children, the journal claimed, grew pale and sickly, their eyes too wide, their laughter too thin. One by one, they succumbed to a wasting sickness, until only the husband remained. He, too, eventually vanished, his last known act a frantic, incoherent letter sent to a distant relative, filled with pleas to burn it all down. The words felt like shards of ice in my gut. I read about a solitary scholar who had moved in during the 1930s, seeking peace for his studies. He was found months later, not vanished, but utterly broken. His mind, the journal stated, had become a tangled knot of fear and delusion. The details were sparse, disjointed, yet they painted a horrifyingly consistent picture. People moved in, they grew isolated, they succumbed to madness or simply ceased to exist. And the common thread, the one that made my stomach clench, was the subtle, insidious presence that the author herself had begun to chronicle, the same one I felt now, pressing in around me. A floorboard creaked upstairs. I froze, my eyes darting towards the ceiling. It wasn't the settling of old wood, it was distinct, heavy, like a deliberate step. My breath caught, held tight in my chest. I listened, every nerve ending screaming, but the sound didn't repeat. Just the faint groan of the old house, a constant low hum that felt less like a building settling and more like a living thing breathing around me. I forced myself to keep reading, the journal now a grotesque anchor in the rising tide of my fear. She spoke of her own reflection changing, of seeing things in the glass that weren't there a moment before. Her handwriting became almost illegible, a frantic scrawl about the hunger and the drain. The last entry, dated just a few weeks before the house had supposedly stood empty, was a single desperate line. It wants more than grief, it wants me. My hands trembled so violently I almost dropped the book. More than grief? What else could it want? My eyes burned, the words blurring on the page. I felt a profound weariness settle over me, heavy as a shroud. The air in the library, once merely cool, now felt impossibly dense, pressing against my skin. The faint scent of dust and aged paper was now overlaid with something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten blood. I couldn't read anymore. The weight of the house's history, of its victims, pressed down on me, making my head throb. I closed the journal, carefully placing it back in the box, my movements slow and deliberate. Every muscle in my body ached with tension. Sleep felt impossible, yet the exhaustion was absolute. My sleep was not restful. It was a descent into a landscape of broken memories and distorted fears. I was back in a school hallway after midnight, lockers humming. The familiar beige lockers stretched endlessly, their metallic surfaces reflecting a sickly green glow from unseen emergency lights. The hum was a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floor and up into my teeth. It wasn't the sound of electricity. It was deeper, older, a sound that felt like it had always been there, waiting. No answer. I saw my reflection in the polished linoleum floor, stretched and distorted, my face pale. It swelled, consuming my mirrored image, then receded, leaving only the dull sheen of the floor. A locker door at the far end of the hall, one I was sure had been closed, stood ajar. A sliver of absolute blackness bled from its opening. Not a person, not a thing I could name, but a presence. It was the same presence I'd felt in the house, but here, in this impossible place, it was concentrated, distilled into a suffocating density. It beckoned, a silent pull that twisted my insides. My chest tightened, a vice clamping down on my lungs. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The hum of the lockers grew louder, a vibrating roar that filled my head, drowning out all other thoughts. I felt a pressure, a probing touch against the inside of my skull, not painful but invasive, seeking. It was sifting through my memories, my fears, searching for something. For what? I woke with a gasp, my body rigid, my heart racing. The only sound was the familiar, ancient creak of the house. Had it been a dream, or had something truly touched my mind, even in sleep, searching for a deeper entryway? Pressing against my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. My lungs ached with the unseen weight. The words on the yellowed page, which had just spoken of something more than grief, seemed to writhe, the ink momentarily darkening, then lightening, as if breathing with the oppressive air. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to clear the phantom film that coded them to dispel the image of the text twisting. When I opened them again, the book lay open, static, innocent. But the feeling of being watched, of being preyed upon, remained. A cold, slender whisper snaked around my ear, brushing against the fine hairs on my neck. It spoke of inadequacy, of all the things I hadn't done, all the chances I'd squandered. It brought forth the faces of those I'd lost, their expressions tinged with disappointment, their silent judgment echoing the entity's insidious hum. My breath hitched. This wasn't just sadness. This was targeted, surgical. It knew my deepest anxieties, the quiet despair I rarely let surface. The sound felt like a defiance, a small tremor against the growing pressure. I stood, pushing back from the heavy oak table, my chair scraping loudly. The library, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. I needed air. I needed to escape the smothering awareness of its presence. I stumbled towards the door, my legs heavy, my head light. Each step felt like wading through thick mud. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my weight, a chorus of protest. It twisted, but the door didn't budge. I pulled harder, then pushed, rattling the old wood in its frame. It was locked. It had never been locked before. I threw my shoulder against the door, grunting with effort, but it held firm. Nothing. The air thrummed with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through the soles of my feet, up my spine, into my skull. It felt like the house itself was breathing, a slow, predatory inhale. Then the world tilted. The library walls rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. The heavy bookshelves blurred, their spines dissolving into streaks of color. The floor beneath me dissolved, and I felt a sickening lurch, a freefall into nothingness. My stomach dropped. When my vision cleared, I was standing in a long, sterile corridor. The air was frigid, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old dust and something vaguely chemical. On either side, rows upon rows of metal lockers stretched into the gloom, their dull gray surfaces reflecting the sputtering light. A low, persistent humming resonated from them, a mechanical thrum that vibrated through the floor and up into my teeth. I was in a school hallway after midnight, lockers humming. My mind reeled. This wasn't possible. I had been in the library in the house. How could I be here? My breath plumed in the cold air. It was solid, real, too real. The humming intensified, a low drone that seemed to vibrate directly inside my skull. It spoke of missed opportunities, of the times I'd stood by silent when I should have spoken. It pulled at old wounds, the sting of being an outsider, the ache of never quite fitting in. A locker door down the hall, perhaps 20 feet away, slowly, silently swung open. I took a step back, my heart a frantic bird trapped in my chest. Another locker opened, then another, a slow, creeping wave of yawning metal mouths. Each creak, each soft sigh of opening, echoed unnaturally loud in the vast, empty space. The humming grew frantic, a buzzing swarm in my ears. But something else was there too, just behind my shoulder in the reflection. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the endless row of lockers, their doors now all silently ajar like 1,000 empty mouths. It was delicate, insistent, like fingernails dragging across dry slate. It was a memory, a phantom accusation from a long-dead argument, twisted and amplified. Scratching grew louder, more frantic, a desperate clawing, something that would break me. This wasn't just about grief. It was about my failures, my guilt. It was about every crack in my resolve, every moment of self-doubt. The entity wasn't just feeding, it was dissecting. Was this what it wanted? To tear my mind apart, piece by agonizing piece, until there was nothing left but a shell for it to inhabit. And if so, what would it do then? The invitation, my breath hitched. I felt a profound, chilling certainty that if I looked inside that locker, I would see something I could not unsee. Something that would unravel me. The metallic tang of old rust filled my nostrils, sharp and acrid, mixed with something else, something cloying like wilting lilies left too long in a stagnant vase. I stood there, paralyzed in the impossible school hallway after midnight, lockers humming. Each locker door gleamed faintly under the low, flickering fluorescence, reflecting distorted slivers of my own terrified face. The humming wasn't just the lights, it was a deeper thrum, a vibration that resonated in my bones, a song of anticipation. My fingers, cold and numb, hovered inches from the latch of the offending locker. My mind screamed at me to run, to turn my back on this spectral scene, but my feet were rooted to the linoleum. Then the scratching ceased, abruptly. The sudden silence was worse, a hollow void where the frantic noise had been. My own ragged breathing sounded impossibly loud. I swallowed, a thick, dry gulp. I didn't want to see, I didn't want to understand this. My grief, my loneliness, my aimlessness, these were wounds, not curiosities to be poked and prodded by whatever malevolence inhabited this house, twisting my memories into monstrous parodies. I took a shaky step back, then another. It felt like a phantom touch, a comforting hand on my shoulder. The air around me seemed to thicken, taking on the consistency of velvet. I could almost lean into it, almost rest. My mind, so long a battlefield of anxieties, yearned for that cessation of struggle. The locker, for an instant, looked less like a tomb and more like a gateway to understanding. You belong here, with us. A vision flickered at the periphery of my sight, not the school, but the familiar, decaying wallpaper of the house. They weren't monstrous, they were simply present. Waiting, they offered no threat, only an endless, profound companionship, the kind that would never leave. But the warmth, the promise, felt wrong. It was a comfort woven with threads of deep, inescapable despair. I saw the trap for what it was. This wasn't solace, it was absorption. This wasn't connection, it was dissolution. I had to fight this. I had to break free. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy against the cold metal. I needed to call someone, anyone. A colleague from my old job, the estate lawyer, even the delivery driver who dropped off my groceries last week. A voice, any voice that wasn't this insidious chorus. My thumb mashed the screen, finding the contact for the estate lawyer, a sensible woman with a crisp, no-nonsense tone. Her voice would be an anchor. The phone rang, a tinny, desperate sound in the spectral hallway. 1 ring, 2, 3. Each ring echoed, magnified, distorting into a dissonant chime. The lockers began to hum with a new intensity, a frantic, vibrating drone that rattled my teeth. On the 4th ring, a click. "Hello," I croaked, my voice cracking. "It's Seth. I need to talk about the house. Something's happening." There was a pause, not a normal pause, but a complete, utter absence of sound. Then a soft, wet thump, and another, like something heavy, pulpy being dropped on a damp earth. The sound grew closer, steadily, rhythmically, punctuated by a faint, sickly sweet odor that reminded me of overripe fruit left to rot. It wasn't the lawyer's office. It wasn't anything human. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. It was coming for me through the phone. Then the line went dead. My phone screen went black, unresponsive. I jabbed at the power button, but nothing. It was a dead weight in my hand, inert. The invitation was still there, palpable, shimmering just beyond my sight. It promised an end to loneliness, an end to grief, an end to everything that weighed me down. But what would be left of me if I accepted? The phantom warmth in my chest flared again, mingling with the chilling knowledge that I was truly, utterly alone. The school hallway after midnight, lockers humming began to dissolve at the edges, replaced by the familiar, encroaching shadows of the house. The invitation was still there, palpable. Then it didn't dissolve. It solidified. One moment, I was standing in the encroaching gloom of the ancestral home. The next, the sharp tang of antiseptic and stale sweat filled my nostrils. The air, heavy and unnaturally still, pressed in around me. This wasn't a memory fragment anymore. This was a place. I was here, in the school hallway after midnight, lockers humming. My breath hitched. My vision swam for a moment, the world tilting as if I stood on a ship's deck. It felt real, too real. The dull metallic clang resonated through the quiet, a stark counterpoint to the low, pervasive hum that vibrated through the floor and up my legs. This was no longer a fleeting glimpse, a trick of the mind. My hands, clammy and trembling, traced the painted numbers on the locker, 113. A single scratch marred the chipped green enamel, a tiny crescent moon. I remembered that scratch. I remembered this locker, my locker. But that was decades ago. I wasn't a teenager. I wasn't in school. I tried to swallow, but my throat was tight, dry. The humming intensified, a low-frequency thrum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in my bones. It wasn't the sound of fluorescent lights, not exactly. It was deeper, more resonant, like a vast, unseen engine idling just beneath the floorboards. I pushed off the locker, taking a step back. The scuffed linoleum beneath my worn boots felt slick, as if coated in a fine, invisible film. My eyes darted down the endless corridor. Row upon row of lockers, stretching into the gloom, their muted colors, institutional green, faded blue, sickly yellow, blurring into an indistinct mass. No windows, no doors leading outside. It can't be real. But my fingers still tingled from the cold metal. My ears still vibrated with the hum. This was happening. My mental defenses, already threadbare, began to unravel with terrifying speed. I was no longer observing a nightmare. I was living it. A sudden, sharp thump echoed from further down the hallway. It sounded like something heavy dropping or perhaps a locker door slamming shut. I flinched, my whole body tensing. I peered into the dimness but saw nothing. Just the endless rows, the flickering lights, the deep, resonant hum. My legs felt like lead, yet I forced myself to move. A slow, deliberate walk, each footfall seeming unnaturally loud. I needed to find an exit, a door, anything that didn't lead deeper into this impossible labyrinth. I passed locker after locker, the painted numbers blurring into a meaningless sequence. My old locker 113 was gone, or I had moved. I didn't know. The hallway felt infinite. The humming grew louder, a palpable pressure against my eardrums. It wasn't just sound. It was almost a physical presence, vibrating in the very air, making the hair on my arms stand on end. I imagined the lockers themselves were humming, a silent choir of metal and emptiness. Then I saw it. Just a crack, barely an inch, but enough to reveal the absolute blackness within. No light from inside. It was a sound like strained wire or a rusty hinge slowly turning in the wind. A sound that raised gooseflesh across my scalp. I stopped dead. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn and flee in the opposite direction. But I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot. The whine grew, a keening lament that felt like it was clawing at the inside of my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it away. "Wake up," I pleaded with myself. "Wake up, Seth." When I opened them again, the locker door was still ajar, but now a faint, sickly green light pulsed from within the crack. And the whine, it was louder, it was closer. It was inside my head. My vision blurred again, this time not from dizziness but from the sudden sting of tears. A desperate sob choked in my chest. I was trapped. I was truly, utterly trapped. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake from. This wasn't a trick of the light in the old house. This was real. The entity had pulled me into its realm, into this school hallway after midnight, lockers humming, and it had no intention of letting me go. The green light pulsed, brighter now, and the whine intensified, becoming a distorted, elongated note that stretched and warped as if a string were being pulled tighter and tighter, about to snap. I took a stumbling step backward, then another, my hands reaching out blindly, desperate for something to hold onto, something real. What was behind that door? My vision fractured. The school hallway after midnight, lockers humming, was a place I hadn't seen since I was a teenager, a place I hadn't thought about in years. But here it was, stark and cold, the sickly green light now not just pulsing from the locker crack, but bleeding into the air itself, painting the scuffed linoleum and the faded posters with an unnatural glow. The whine inside my head intensified, a high-pitched vibration that rattled my teeth, making my skull feel like a brittle cage. My breath hitched. I wasn't just seeing it, I was in it. The metallic tang of old lockers and forgotten lunches, a scent I remembered with a shudder, filled my nostrils. The air was frigid, raising goosebumps on my arms, a stark contrast to the clammy sweat on my back. I reached out a hand, half expecting to touch the cold, painted metal of a locker door, but my fingers passed through empty air, leaving a shimmering ripple in the green haze. This wasn't real, not in the way I understood real. The humming of the lockers grew louder, a chorus of low, guttural vibrations that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It wasn't the sound of faulty wiring. It was something deeper, a resonance that vibrated in my bones. The green light pulsed faster now, like a monstrous heart beating in the core of this spectral corridor, and with each pulse images flashed not in my eyes but directly in my mind. A woman gaunt and weeping, clutching a faded photograph. Her face, etched with despair, was so vivid I could almost feel the hot tears on her cheeks. Loneliness radiated from him, a palpable shroud. Grief, despair, isolation. These were not just emotions, they were flavors, colors, sustenance. The green light flared, blinding me for a moment, and when it receded, the images became clearer, more cohesive. I saw the house, my ancestral home, but it was ancient, not just old. And then I saw it. Not a solid form, not a creature of flesh and bone, but a shimmering, indistinct presence like smoke given malevolent will. It was a consciousness, a parasitic intelligence that had rooted itself in the very foundations of the land long before any human structure had ever stood there. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a spirit of the dead. It was something far older, a primordial hunger that had slumbered beneath the earth, awakened by the raw, potent energy of human suffering. The house, I realized with a sickening lurch, was not just its dwelling, it was its lure. A carefully constructed trap, drawing in those who were already broken, those whose hearts were fertile ground for its insidious feast. The images accelerated, a flood of suffering. I saw the entity weaving through the lives of the house's inhabitants, subtly twisting their thoughts, amplifying their fears, isolating them from any hope of comfort. It didn't kill them outright, it fed on them. It nurtured their grief, cultivated their despair, until they were so consumed by it that their very essence became a rich, potent meal. It was a gradual draining, a slow, agonizing consumption of their emotional core, leaving behind only husks. My own grief, the raw wound of my losses, the gnawing loneliness I had brought with me to the house, it was all a beacon. I was not just living in a haunted house, I was a carefully selected crop, tended for harvest. The entity was not a specter to be banished, it was a predator and I was its prey. My stomach churned, and I felt bile rise in my throat. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms, but the pain was a distant echo. This wasn't a haunting, it was a slow, deliberate consumption. It had been playing with me, fattening me up, making sure my despair was ripe. The school hallway shimmered, the lockers still humming, but now their metallic surfaces seemed to ripple, distort, as if reality itself was being stretched thin. The green light pulsed, a steady, rhythmic throb, and I felt its tendrils reaching, not for my body, but for the raw, exposed nerves of my mind. It was trying to draw me deeper, to show me more, to make me understand its hunger. I stumbled backward, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. The truth was worse than any phantom. It was a living, ancient, parasitic consciousness, and it wanted to devour me whole. I was not just a victim, I was a meal in progress. How could I fight something that fed on my very soul? The sickly green light, pulsing from the locker crack, now bled into the air itself, painting the entire school hallway after midnight, lockers humming in a nauseating glow. My vision fractured, the edges of my sight blurring, but the cold, hard reality of the linoleum beneath my worn boots was undeniable. This wasn't some fleeting image. I was here. The hum of the lockers vibrated in my teeth, a low, incessant thrum that felt less like machinery and more like a living thing breathing. Dust motes danced in the unnatural light, suspended in air thick with the scent of old gym shoes and forgotten textbooks. A wave of nausea rolled over me, but I fought it back. I wouldn't surrender. Not now. I remembered the hurried, frantic scrawl in the old journal, the warnings about illusions, about the entity's power to twist perception, to make the impossible real. It fed on despair, on loneliness, on the very fabric of my grief. I had to fight it to break free. My breath hitched, a sharp, cold intake of air. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My fingers curled into fists, nails digging into my palms, a small anchor of pain in a sea of unreality. I focused on that sensation, on the dull ache, on the rough texture of my jeans. I wouldn't let it drag me down. My escape hinged on defying its reality, on finding my own. At the far end of the impossibly long hallway, a heavy fire door painted a faded, chipped red stood out like a beacon. It looked solid, substantial, a tangible link to a world beyond this spectral school. That had to be it, a way out. My muscles tensed, a jolt of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I started walking, each step deliberate, heavy. I ignored it. My focus was the door, only the door, but the hallway stretched. With every step I took, the red door seemed to recede, mocking my progress. My legs grew heavy, like I was wading through thick, invisible water. The air grew dense, pressing against my chest, making each breath a struggle. The hum of the lockers was no longer just a hum. It was a low, guttural growl that resonated in my bones. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the growing cacophony. Was it just trying to exhaust me? The metal was slick, almost wet, with a thin film of dust that clung to my fingertips. The surface vibrated violently under my touch, and for a split second I saw my own reflection, warped and elongated, staring back from the dull finish. My eyes were wide, bloodshot, and behind me the hallway seemed to twist and churn. The green light flared, blinding me for a moment, and when my vision cleared, the door was suddenly much closer, almost within reach. A trick, I knew it, but a part of me, weary and desperate, hoped it wasn't. I lunged for the heavy bar of the fire door, my shoulders slamming against the cold metal as I pushed with all my might. The door groaned, a long, drawn-out shriek of rusted hinges, and slowly, grudgingly, it swung inward. But there was no outside. There was only another hallway, identical in every sickening detail. It stretched into infinity, a mirror image of the one I had just left, and the one before that, and the one before that. My breath caught in my throat, a ragged gasp. I saw it then in the polished surface of a locker directly opposite me, the reflection of my own face contorted in a silent scream. But it wasn't just my face. And behind them, stretching into the endless, repeating corridors, were countless other reflections, distorted, fading, each one a different version of me, or perhaps what was left of me. My past, my present, my future, all laid out in an inescapable, repeating loop. This wasn't just a trap it had set for me. I was the very mechanism of the trap itself, my memories, my despair, fueling its endless labyrinth. What else did it need from me now that I was truly snared? Unbearable. It wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that stole the heat from my bones, leaving behind a hollow ache. My vision fractured, the edges of my sight blurring, but the cold, hard reality of the linoleum beneath my worn boots was undeniably, terrifyingly real. The hum of the lockers, once a distant drone, swelled into a chorus, a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the soles of my feet up my spine and into the soft tissue of my brain. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at the inside of my skull. The green light intensified, washing over the dull, polished surfaces, making them shimmer with an unnatural wetness. I could almost taste it, a metallic tang like old pennies left in stagnant water, thick and cloying in the back of my throat. The hallway stretched before me, a tunnel of pulsating emerald. The lockers on either side seemed to stretch too, their grimy beige paint now a sickly yellow-green, their vents like gaping, silent mouths. They weren't just humming, they were breathing. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, a dizzying nausea that made the floor tilt and sway. Was I falling? Or was the hallway itself twisting, distorting around me? My thoughts fragmented, breaking apart like brittle glass. Memories, sharp and vivid just moments before, turned to smoke, drifting away on an unseen current. My mother's face, the curve of her smile, the sound of her laughter, it was all there, then gone, replaced by a vague sense of loss, a formless grief that tasted like ash. My father, his strong hands, the scent of sawdust and oil that always clung to him faded, leaving only a dull ache in my chest. This wasn't just forgetting, it was an erasure. Something was reaching into the deepest recesses of my mind, plucking out the threads that defined me, unraveling them one by one. It was as if my very essence was draining out, replaced by this invasive, buzzing green. My hands trembled, clammy and weak. I tried to clench them to make a fist, to feel the solid resistance of bone and muscle, but they felt like loose bags of sand, unresponsive. My knees buckled. I slumped against the nearest locker, the cool metal a momentary anchor, though even it seemed to vibrate with the entity's hungry thrum. This was it. This was the feeding. I understood it now with a clarity that sliced through the haze of my weakening mind. It wasn't just my despair it wanted. It was the very memory of what I had lost, the reason for the despair. It wasn't just consuming my sorrow. It was consuming me, the person who felt it, leaving behind only an empty vessel, a husk. But in that pain, in that stark, horrifying moment of understanding, something shifted. As the entity tried to pull the last vestiges of my mother's image from my mind, not the grief, not the emptiness, but the sheer, undeniable love I had for her flared. It wasn't a memory of her death, but a flash of her alive, truly alive. Laughing at something silly I'd said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. The warmth of her hand in mine, walking through a park on a sunny day. The entity recoiled, a subtle tremor running through the hallway. The green light flickered, a momentary stutter in its relentless pulse. It had tried to devour the grief, but instead it had bitten into the very source of what made me human, what made me me. The love wasn't despair, it was a connection, an unbreakable bond that even this thing couldn't sever without a fight. "I won't have it," I gasped, the words pushing past a throat suddenly tight with defiance. My voice was still weak, but it was my voice. I pushed away from the locker, staggering, fighting for balance. The linoleum felt less like a shifting sea and more like solid ground beneath my boots. The green light flared again, brighter, angrier, as if annoyed by my resistance. The locker's hum escalated to a piercing whine, threatening to shatter my eardrums. It wanted to extinguish it, to consume it whole. My head pounded, a drumbeat against my skull. My vision swam again, the hallway twisting into impossible angles, the green light coalescing into swirling patterns that pulled at my sight, threatening to drag me into its depths. My body felt heavy, sluggish, as if encased in lead. Every breath was a monumental effort. But I held onto that memory, that feeling of love, like a desperate man clinging to a life raft in a storm. It was all I had left. It was the last piece of myself the entity hadn't managed to twist into sorrow or despair. It was pure. It was real, and it was mine. The pressure mounted. I felt something trying to tear itself free from my chest, a physical rending. My legs wobbled. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the overwhelming green to focus on the warmth, the light within. The entity was pulling, trying to rip the very core of my being from its anchor. Could I hold on? How much more could I endure before I finally broke? The cold, when it hit, was a physical blow, a fist of ice driven straight into my chest. My breath hitched, a thin vapor struggling to escape my lips, and a tremor ran through my jaw. I could feel it now, a vast, hungry emptiness lurking just beyond the green haze, a presence that pressed in on me from all sides. It wanted to consume, but not anymore. I knew its game. I knew its weakness. "I see you," I rasped, my voice surprisingly steady despite the shiver that racked my frame. The words felt like a challenge hurled into the suffocating quiet. The green light pulsed faster, a frantic beat, and the humming from the lockers intensified, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. It was a low, guttural thrum, like a beast's digestive system. You feed on what's broken, on the cracks in us. You twist the grief, the loneliness, the regret until it's all we can taste. My lungs burned with the effort of speaking, the frigid air searing them. But it's my grief, my loneliness, and you can't have it. The school hallway after midnight, lockers humming buckled. The rows of steel lockers shimmered, their painted surfaces rippling like disturbed water. Then, with a groan that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the air, the locker directly in front of me, the source of that sickening green light, began to pull open. Slowly, agonizingly, they were all there, distorted, accusing. My eyes burned. This was its play, its best weapon, my past weaponized. "I ray alone, Seth. I always were. I let them down. I'll never escape this." My fingers curled into fists, nails digging into my palms, the sharp pain a welcome anchor in the rising tide of internal noise. I pushed back, a desperate, raw effort of will. This wasn't them. This was the entity wearing their faces, twisting their memories, trying to make me believe its lies. A wave of profound sadness washed over me, so potent it felt like a physical blow, stealing my breath. It amplified the guilt, the bitter taste of missed opportunities, the unspoken words that now haunted my waking hours. The green light pulsed, synchronized with the throbbing ache in my temples. No, I choked out a single, defiant word that cut through the maelstrom. My voice cracked, but the resolve held. You don't own my sorrow, you don't own my pain, it belongs to me, it's what makes me real. I slammed my mental fist against the wall of despair it was building, trying to reclaim the emotional landscape of my own mind. You're a parasite, you're nothing but an echo of what's already broken. You can't create. My teeth chattered, but I pressed on. I'm taking it back, all of it. The entity shrieked. It wasn't a sound, not really, but a tearing sensation in my ears, a vibration that shook my very teeth. I felt a pressure immense and crushing, as if the entire house were trying to collapse in on me to squeeze the life out of my defiant lungs. My vision blurred. A deep primal fear, the kind that makes you want to curl into a ball and vanish, threatened to overwhelm me. But I had come too far. I had seen too much. With every ounce of strength I had left, I focused on the core of myself, the stubborn, aching part that refused to break. I imagined a severing, a cutting away of the tendrils it had sunk into my mind, into the very walls of the house. I envisioned a barrier, not of stone or steel, but of pure, unyielding will, separating my grief from its hunger. I pushed, not with my hands, but with everything I had left in my spirit against the vast, consuming emptiness. Green light flared, blindingly bright, then sputtered, flickering. The screams died down to a desperate whine. The pressure eased just a fraction. Had I done it? Had I truly managed to cut it loose? The shriek tore through me, a soundless rupture that vibrated in my bones, rattling my teeth in their sockets. The school hallway after midnight, lockers humming warped, the green light sickening, the shadows elongating into grasping tendrils. I felt myself being pulled, stretched thin, like a canvas ripped from its frame. The faces in the vortex, once indistinct, sharpened into grotesque parodies of human despair, eyes wide with silent terror, mouths agape in soundless screams. They were my grief, my loneliness, reflected back at me, magnified 1,000 times. No, not mine, not anymore. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a parasite. It fed on me, twisted what was real, and offered nothing but oblivion. I wouldn't let it. I wouldn't be another face in its swirling maw. My hands instinctively flew to my ears, trying to block the tearing sensation, but it was inside me, an internal tremor. The entity recoiled just for a fraction of a second, a flicker in the green haze. It was surprised. It expected surrender, not defiance. I opened my eyes. The vortex still churned, but its pull felt less absolute. The school hallway after midnight, lockers humming flickered. The lockers momentarily solidifying, their metallic hum a dull drone beneath the entity's shriek. "I won't have me," I rasped, my voice raw, barely audible over the internal clamor. It wasn't physical, but it buckled my knees, threatened to steal the air from my lungs. It wanted me to remember every loss, every moment of isolation, every failure. The memory of the house wasn't just a source of despair anymore. It was also a place I had fought in, a place where I had learned to distinguish between what was real and what was merely a trick of the light, a whisper in the dark. I had resisted. I had endured. I pushed back, not with a shout, but with a silent, furious rejection. I focused on the feeling of my own skin, the beat of my own heart, the desperate, unyielding will to simply be. The green light pulsed like a wounded thing. This was it, my final stand. I remembered the old journal, the faded ink, the warnings of the previous occupant. It feeds on what I give it. I had been giving it everything, my fear, my sorrow, my loneliness, but what if I simply stopped? What if I starved it? I forced a breath, a ragged, painful inhale. The school hallway after midnight, lockers humming shimmered violently. The lockers seemed to melt, reforming into distorted faces, screaming. The entity was throwing everything it had at me, a desperate, final assault. It was trying to break my mind, to shatter my will. I closed my eyes again, but this time not in surrender. I focused inward on the tiny spark of defiance that still flickered within me. I envisioned a wall built from my own stubborn refusal to yield, a barrier against the onslaught. The tearing sensation intensified, then snapped like a taut rope breaking. My eyes flew open. I was no longer in the school hallway after midnight, lockers humming. The green haze was gone. The vortex, the screaming faces, the unbearable tearing, all gone. I stood in the library of the ancestral home. The room was a wreck. Books lay scattered, pages torn. A grandfather clock in the corner had toppled, its hands frozen at 3:15. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight slicing through a broken window. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and old paper, but the cloying, sickly, sweet scent of decay, the one that had clung to my clothes and hair for weeks, was absent. The silence was profound, almost deafening after the entity's shriek. I sagged against a ruined bookshelf, my legs trembling, my chest heaving. My hands were scraped raw, my clothes torn, though I couldn't remember how. Had I been thrashing, fighting an invisible foe, my head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes, and a ringing persisted in my ears. The entity was gone, or at least it wasn't here. Not in the same way. The house felt empty, not abandoned, but truly empty, like a vacuum had sucked out all the malevolence, leaving behind only the dust and the decay of time. I pushed myself upright, my muscles screaming in protest. I walked to the shattered window, shards of glass crunching under my boots. The entity hadn't just been in the house. It was the house, or rather the house was its anchor, its physical manifestation in this world. And in fighting it, in rejecting its hold, I hadn't destroyed it. I had merely severed its connection to me. Asterisk. The house still stood, silent and imposing under the moonlight. Its walls still breathed, its foundations still held. And if it was merely an anchor, then the entity, whatever it truly was still out there, dormant, waiting for another lonely soul, another grieving heart, another despairing mind to wander into its decaying embrace. I ran a hand over the rough, cold stone of the window frame. But what if the cage could still sing its siren song? What if I had only bought myself time, not freedom? Could I ever truly leave it behind?